welcome to another Sunday live stream on the state of the Russo-Ukrainian war. Greetings from Odessa, Mama. And the three major events to look out for this week in the Russo-Ukrainian war, the war between Ukraine and Russia, is firstly the trilateral talks that are taking place. We'll have another round of what I consider another fiasco, waste of time, which is largely a waste of time. We will have the trilateral talks, US, Russia, and Ukrainian representatives meeting. And if you were to believe the summary coming from the White House, they are so close. They have 95 or 90% of everything settled. They're just need to agree on the territory, of which there is little possibility of agreement. However, this will play out. Both sides are trying to maneuver the negotiations to stay in the good graces of the White House and probably negotiate behind the scenes other things. They will be taking place. It will be the main diplomatic event this week. But I think the really big story, the second thing to look out for, is the energy situation in Ukraine for civilians. Russia has been more successful in destroying a lot of critical infrastructure in Ukraine for this winter, particularly in the capital, Kyiv. And there have been situations in the capital of Ukraine where people have been without water, heat, and electricity for many days, if not weeks on end, depending where you are. So it's a pretty horrific situation. Here in Odessa, the weather has been a bit milder and we haven't been hit as much in the energy sector. However, some parts of the city are regularly without electricity. So it's not as cataclysmic here in the south of Ukraine. However, in Kyiv, in the capital, it has been the main target of these efforts. Donald Trump announced a few days ago that he negotiated an energy ceasefire of some sorts for a week. And the Kremlin has already said, well, basically, they're going to start attacking Ukrainian energy infrastructure today. So basically, it was a respite of a couple of days. Was that really significant? Well, the weathers were a bit milder also in Kyiv compared to the week before, and what's going to start happening from today anyway. So it seems it was just an agreement, an acquiescence by Putin in a sense of a few days when it wasn't strategically important for Russia to strike the energy infrastructure. They were planning presumably to strike it starting from today again as the weather gets a lot colder. That's the logic there. So we'll see that continue historically in a situation which is going to be a three-point situation on the front lines, where we see very little progress in terms of battlefield victories or momentum. Striking civilian infrastructure has proven to be counterproductive in all wars, however, or most wars that have been studied, and this has taken place. However, the Kremlin seems to believe this is a core piece in their strategy, since they've been trying it largely unsuccessfully since 2022. However, they are having more effect in making it uninhabitable to a certain extent at the moment in large parts of Kyiv. So we'll see that continue. And on the front lines, because the nature of warfare has evolved with drone warfare, that we don't have really manned trenches to the same extent we would have seen in 2023 in this war. Now we see a lot of infiltration. Groups, small groups that try to infiltrate behind enemy lines a lot more and more, and then they try to raise a flag, film a video, publish that for propaganda purposes. And we've seen, really, I think for the first time in the war, Russia consistently claiming to have taken territory from Ukraine where they haven't, in fact, taken. So it's hard to know what the reasoning behind that is, because saying that you're taking a certain town, and then, like we saw with Kupiansk, Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukrainian president, goes there and films a selfie video outside the entrance with the stele to Kupiansk. A few days later, basically makes you look a bit of stupid, especially when Putin already given out medals for the supposed victory. And they are continuing to do that. There's a town just south of Kupiansk. It's also called Kupiansk-Volizny. I can't remember the second part of the name, but it's a small hamlet just to the south of Kupiansk, like a sister city that's a lot smaller. And they claim to have taken that, and then some of the Ukrainian military walked around just basically filming, showing that, well, they're not here. So apparently some infiltration groups have managed to, we're talking one or two soldiers, sneak through and then progress a few kilometers past the front lines, and then they claim that they've taken the city. So it's a bit strange. Maybe this is given impression in the negotiations that the Russians are still making progress on the front lines, so therefore Ukraine should capitulate. I don't think anyone really buys that. Maybe it confuses the White House to a certain extent. Very possible. We don't know if they're actually listening to any real intel from the front lines or not at this point. Many of the main cabinet members and the President Trump himself. So maybe that's part of the reasoning behind it, or it's for domestic propaganda purposes. They just want to convince Russians that they're still taking territory and winning when in fact they're not. So none of this bears well for Russia. The weather is pretty dire in Ukraine at the moment, and battlefield advances have slowed to the lowest in about the last year or so. But that's also partly because of the weather. We'll have to see when things thaw out in the spring what the situation is. Is Russia finally have to make some significant breakthrough, something they've been trying for the last, well, it's come up to 3 years without much success? Or are they going to continue to grind forward a kilometer here and there until they run out of steam and culminate in this war? So those are the three things that I see upcoming in this week. Just got a comment here. Things are looking better and better because it seems the Russian economy is getting into real trouble, which I suppose the greatest contribution is due to the low oil prices. Yes, Russia's ability to fund the war has been compromised. However, Russian economy, and partly because they have very skilled economists that were trained in the West, ironically, to keep the economy going longer than it should otherwise be possible to maintain it without panic in, at least in Moscow. It doesn't look like it's going to collapse tomorrow. However, it's just slowly but surely being hollowed out. And at a certain point, they won't be able to kick the can down the road any further, especially if oil prices stay low. This is one thing with the presidency of Trump that has compromised Russia to a certain extent, because the Trump administration has been okay with seizing even Russian shadow fleet oil transport ships that basically allow them to export illegally their own oil products. The fact that he's gone after that, hits into their bottom line. Plus, Trump basically wants to flood the market as much as possible, it seems, in terms of oil for his own strategic purposes, what he envisions in the world. So that part of Trump's foreign policy has hurt the ability of Russia to finance this war. However, they didn't have a big national debt in the past, so they're not at the point yet where they're going to collapse. But they do face a huge issue in the fact that they can't cheaply fund debt. So basically, they can take on the debt, but they would very quickly find themselves situated where it would spiral out of control in terms of their national debt to GDP. Plus, a lot of what they've been doing in terms of productivity is with respect to the war economy. It's not a full war economy, but it's getting, basically it's crowding out more and more of the domestic industry. And saying that you produce a tank is worth X million rubles, and then 3 weeks later it's blown up in Ukraine with the tank crew inside, isn't something that's going to provide long-term productivity for the Russian economy. So slowly but surely, as I've been saying for over 2 years on this channel, second half of 2025 was the time when really the Russian economy would get in a lot of trouble. That is what's happening at the moment as we go into 2026. They have high inflation, high interest rates. They have plummeting oil revenues, basically. So even though they say they're going to spend 40% of their budget on the military and the internal security this year, just as they did in 2025, it's not sure what 40% means. And in fact, it's going to be way, way higher because they're just going to have a lot less revenue coming into the budget. That seems to be the case. Could change. We're only in the first, we just went into the second month today of the year. But if that continues, then it is going to be a massive issue for the ability to continue to pay for materiel, to pay soldiers in this war, and to keep the Russian populace going along with acquiescing basically with this war. I spoke a few days ago to someone who lived in Russia for a long time, and he thinks that the Russian population will just suck it up, even if the economy basically implodes, and that imperialism is such a strong motivating factor for them that they'll be willing to suffer. We have to see. This is not the same situation was in the Soviet Union when they were last really tested to that extent, just because in the 90s Russia's economy imploded, and or former Soviet Union countries, all their economies imploded for a few years, and then they had to be rebuilt up again. It's not really clear to me that because this is a war of choice, an imperial war, whether Russians be simply willing to go along with it and suffer in terms of their own economic standards, especially if there's no light at the end of the tunnel. This may be why Russia is claiming to have captured towns that it hasn't actually captured, because they want to give the impression that they're still got the momentum and they will still win. As I've outlined, my thesis is that Vladimir Putin is trapped by this war, that he can't end it without a strategic victory, because then he's scared of losing power in Russia, and that wouldn't end very well for him, and his legacy would be basically destroyed. He wouldn't have been able to expand Russian influence. Well, he's basically lost Russian influence. It's actually regressed with this war, but definitely in terms of territorial expansion, it's pretty lackluster to have taken only 20% of Ukraine with a war that's gone over 10 years at this point. And with this invasion, we're coming up, the second invasion, the one of 2022, we're coming up to the 4th anniversary already. So we will see. I did say at the top of the beginning of the year that I see a 50-50 chance that there will be some sort of temporary pause in fighting at some stage during the year, possibly if Russia takes a wild gamble to go and attack a NATO state. They would want to redeploy troops, and presumably stopping the fighting or limiting it in Ukraine while they do that will be something that would be probably necessary for the Russian Federation. I'm much more optimistic about 2027. I think just the Russian economy at that point will be in such a bad situation after another year of low revenues and just huge expenses being wasted on this war, that there would be basically a tipping point in 2027. I see about 80% that we will see some pause in the fighting at that point, if not actually the end of the war or the beginning of the end of the war at that stage. So continue to drop your questions and comments down below. Also, if you're watching this on replay, and if you are planning to come here to Ukraine, I have my guide, basically, or you just want to help the channel out in general, this kind of content, I have my guide for insider's guide for coming to Ukraine during this Russo-Ukrainian war. Not only do you get the safety and logistical information, historical background, but also my hospitality guide for Kyiv, Odessa, Lviv, Chernovtsi, and Uzhhorod, where I outline my favorite cafes, bars, shisha lounges, and restaurants. There isn't so much clubbing going on in Ukraine these days because of curfew, but there is a little bit in Lviv, and there is a little bit in Uzhhorod, which doesn't have a curfew. It's in Zakarpattia, the Zakarpatska Oblast in the west of Ukraine. That is the only region in Ukraine with no curfew. So you can invest in that down below. And we have more comment from Ray saying that he'd love to go to Ukraine to be a volunteer sometime in the future. Definitely something I encourage. If you come here to Ukraine and you do best to help the people, whether that is volunteering on the humanitarian side or with the defense of the country, will definitely be greatly appreciated and give you a lot of fulfillment in terms of helping Ukraine resist, and basically the rest of Europe, because Ukraine is defending the rest of the continent against Russian imperial expansion and aggression. So Ray says, as long as Ukraine can keep getting funded while Russia struggles with war machine costs, then it won't matter what the Russian population thinks that it can cope with. Well, Ukraine got the funding for another 2 years, basically, to keep going. And that is a massive problem for Vladimir Putin as well, because this year doesn't have elections in Europe that look like they would result in a favorable change of political momentum towards the Kremlin. We're going to have elections in April in Hungary, where if you look at Polling Market, Viktor Orban is expected to lose. It's not clear cut. It looks like being a tight election. That would be a huge blow for the Kremlin to lose that ally in the European Union, in an EU country. And then next year, there will be some elections, like the French have a presidential election, if I remember, that is scheduled. And maybe there will be even a British parliamentary elections. Those could be two elections that would see more pro-Kremlin leaders come to power. Although reform has started to, in the UK, it's basically become, with a lot of defections from the Tories, like the Tory party with Farage in charge, basically, from what I can see. And it has also distanced itself more and more from both Donald Trump and the MAGA crowd, as well as the the Kremlin, that there was a big scandal where a member of Reform was in prison, I think for about 10 years for accepting money from the Kremlin. So this has been a huge problem for Reform, so they're trying to distance themselves. So yeah, whether they would turn out to be so pro-Kremlin, bit debatable, and it's not even clear they would win the election because, yeah, their closeness to the scandal involving you think he was their Reform leader in Wales, was convicted of receiving bribes from Russia, and then Donald Trump basically insulting all the NATO troops who had died in activation of Article 5 and defense of Article 5 when the US invoked it after 9/11. It didn't go down well in most of Europe, in particular in the UK. It went down like a lead balloon. So that has also hurt these parties in general that tend to be aligned with MAGA. And a lot of those, not all, but it's not exactly a Venn diagram one for one, but many of them are also pro-Kremlin. So he has this issue in 2026. So going to 2027, I guess he can try and hold on, hoping that the political winds change in a lot of those elections. However, the Russian economy will be huge problems at that point. So it's going to be interesting to see if he's in fact able to cling on to power and keep the war going, or he will just have to, at that point, agree to stop it. If there, then we can get into thinking about the scenarios. If he agrees to stop it, I don't see Ukraine ever accepting that Russia's de jure control of any occupied Ukrainian territory. And basically Ukraine would then aim to do what Azerbaijan has done. If there is a pause in the fighting, what Azerbaijan did with Nagorno-Karabakh was basically to arm themselves to the teeth for a couple of decades, and then they came back and they retook that territory that was, well, it was a separatist enclave with ethnic Armenians, and they took that back. So that would probably be the strategy. I don't think they'd be willing to wait 2 decades to come back and take it. I think it would be something that would aim to do as Russia presumably would get weaker and weaker with such a calamitous economy and probably a lot of civil strife and potential for secession within Russia, especially in the Caucasus with Chechnya. And that is going to be a succession battle because Ramzan Kadyrov appears to be ill. He's looked ill for a couple of years, and his son Adam Kadyrov was very badly injured in a car accident a couple of weeks ago, and he was his anointed heir to take over, which means probably, well, at least I'm going into a little bit of conspiracy theory stuff here, but it is kind of odd that he had a big car accident when, presumably, because of his age, the Kremlin was not so impressed with him being the heir apparent to take over in Chechnya, and that they had someone else in mind, presumably. So in that scenario where Ramzan Kadyrov loses power, he dies basically, is probably the most likely reason that's going to happen. There would probably be a huge battle of succession. Ukraine would clearly must have a plan in place to try to interfere in that, and there are many Chechens who fight in the Ukrainian armed forces as well, so perhaps they would want them to go back and cause much trouble in Russia. So I'm going to leave it at that. Link below for the guide, and I wish you a pleasant Sunday afternoon from Odessa, Mama. We got a little bit of sunshine outside, just looking out the window. So, Slava Ukraini, do peremoghi. Ciao, ciao.